the Atlantic. Where's it leading us, Jeremy?
Well, I think in the short term, the path of least resistance continues to be towards dollar weakness. If and until markets are happy to believe that the US administration are starting to look towards tightening policy, then it's going to be the case that the dollar is going to remain under pressure. And so that probably means, certainly through the end of the year and the seasonal tendencies which tend to work against the dollar, it means a weaker dollar trend unless there's a serious change in risk appetite.
But unhappy finance ministers gathered in Luxembourg yesterday. We had Juncker talking about it. We had Christine Lagarde talk about it. I mean, what can they actually do except for rhetoric, airing their displeasure at the dollar's weakness?
Well, certainly rhetoric is one thing. I mean, but in a sense, you could argue that actually the rhetoric is still relatively low key. So Mrs. Lagarde has been clearly raising the issue about the weakness of the dollar over the course of recent weeks, certainly over the last month or so. But I think we need to see a much higher degree of concern being identified from the Eurozone officials, perhaps also from Germany notably, rather than necessarily being from more sort of a French angle. I think that we would need to see a broader brush and a much more vocal condemnation of the rise of the euro to see anything approaching something which is going to arrest its rise at this point.
Sterling, meanwhile, hasn't had the best of 3 months, has it? And you told me in the break, in the last 3 months, the dollar's had a gloomy time, but sterling's actually underperformed, hasn't it?
Indeed, sterling is the only currency, or it's down amongst the dead men with the dollar over the course of the last 3 months. It's a case that both are afflicted by the same problems in so much as a very weak budgetary position, obviously interest rates at record lows, but also concerns about that budgetary backdrop going forward. Now, we get public finance numbers this morning. They're not going to make pleasant reading. Speculative investors have really been building a very aggressive short positions over the course of the last few weeks, and so again it seems rather difficult to stand in the way of being negative in sterling, at least in the short term.
What could turn it? Let's say the Bank of England says, you know what, we're going to pause on QE. Would that be positive on sterling? Or
I think it would. I think that there are twin-fold reasons why sterling's been under particular pressure over the course of the last 3 months. It was, of course, going back to that August rate decision where the bank surprised the markets by extending QE, and of course the governor voted for even more QE once we saw those minutes. And there was also the market's impression that the bank were much happier to try and talk down sterling, and I think that was also perhaps a little bit of a misalignment in terms of market expectations compared to where the bank was saying, well, actually the weakening of sterling that we've seen over the last 12 months is good news for the recovery process, rather than necessarily trying to talk it down further.
So the Bank of England doesn't have to worry about rate hikes. Australia, we know, has hiked rates. We got the minutes from that meeting where they did hike rates to 3.25%. The central bank said keeping borrowing costs low was no longer necessary. More rate hikes to come, and positive for the Aussie dollar.
More rate hikes to come. I mean, after all, you have to remember that we've only seen 1 quarter of negative growth in Australia this time last year. So, in a sense, when you've seen the degree of fiscal expansion and or the emergency monetary policy setting, it's not surprising that the RBA are saying, well, that's no longer necessary, let's start to get back to normal. Maybe a case that the market's getting a little bit too bulled up about the propensity for hikes in the very short term. So that might make the market just a little bit vulnerable to say, well, extrapolating the RBA language to say, well, maybe they'll hike rather too fast before the end of the year. And so that might make some of those Aussie longs a little bit vulnerable, particularly with the positioning fairly extreme.
Is that the game in town now? Who's next after Australia?
Absolutely. I mean in a sense, as soon as the RBA moved, well, even ahead of the RBA move, when there was speculation that the RBA were going to move, and obviously the discussion about the timing, but once they pulled the trigger, it was very much a case of, well, where next? Where are the central banks which have got the most proactive monetary policy? So it's a combination of monetary policy and or commodity exposure and risk appetite. Those currencies are the ones that are really seeing the explosive gain. So it's Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Brazil. Those are all the economies and currencies that have really been the very strong performers over the recent period.
Jeremy, thanks very much indeed. Jeremy
Thanks
there
so much,
from Rabobank. Right, let's see what spread bettors expect the opener. A happy David Buick.